So I'm going to hand over to Ariel, who's going to introduce our special guest for this morning, and then we'll get started.
Great. Thanks, Jackie. And thanks everyone for joining. We're grateful that you are taking an hour of your day today to sit with us. We're really excited about today's webinar. We have two incredible experts. So I'm going to take a moment to read their bios because I think it's just important to see who we have in front of us today and who we're learning from. I've had the pleasure of working with Shay Rhodes for probably the past, 8 or 10 years at this point, and as someone who I really look up to and respect and is really just a powerhouse in this movement. So I'm going to start with Shay. So Shay Rhodes Esquire has dedicated her career to combating gender-based violence. As co-founder of the Director of Institute to Address Commercial Sexual Exploitation, the CSE Institute at Villanova Law School, Ms. Rhodes works with and for victims and survivors of commercial sexual exploitation. She's a statewide expert on Pennsylvania laws related to sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Ms. Rhodes is a member of several local and national anti-trafficking initiatives, including the Philadelphia's Anti-Trafficking Coalition, the Pennsylvania Anti-Human Trafficking Advocacy Work Group, and Shared Hope International's Just Response Council. She also sits on the executive committees for World Without Exploitation and Dawn's Place. Her dedication resulted in Legal Intelligencer naming her a 2019 Power Player. She was awarded a Fulbright European Union Affairs Program Scholarship to conduct research in Austria and Sweden during the 2020-2021 academic year. Ms. Rhodes conducts trainings and presentations locally, nationally, and internationally. Her written materials can be found on the CSE Institute website. She is a graduate of Villanova Law School and University of Kansas. So thank you, Shay, for joining us. And next we have Ann Mathewson, is the project director for the Empower Center at the Sanctuary for Families, SFF. Ann's career has focused on addressing the intersecting issues of commercial sexual exploitation and violence against women and girls through advocacy, activism, policy research, direct service, and outreach and training. In her previous role at SFF, Ann was the lead program specialist for the Justice and Empowerment for Teens Initiative, an outreach training and clinical program serving young adult survivors of commercial sexual exploitation. In January 2018, Ann joined the Executive Council of World Without Exploitation. The World Without Exploitation is a national advocacy organization committed to creating a world where no human is bought or sold. As a subject matter expert at the Organization for Prostitution Survivors and research commercial sexual exploitation policy, coordinated community trainings, and facilitated workshops. In 2015, Ann co-founded We Fight Back, a boxing empowerment program for women who have survived sexual violence. As a 2012 Fulbright Fellow, she researched global prostitution policy in Sweden. In 2014, she published Prostitution Policy, Legalization, Decriminalization, and the Nordic Model in the Journal for Social Justice. Ann earned her Master's of Social Work degree with a concentration in public policy and administration from the University of Washington. So as you can hear, we truly have the experts in this topic with us today. And so we're just so excited to learn from both of them, and we're going to turn it over to them right now. So thanks, Shane and Ann, for joining us.
Ariel, it's always so great to see you. We miss having you here in Philadelphia, and it is my pleasure to co-present with Ann, who is, in addition to being just such a powerhouse in this movement, a really close, good friend. And so I'm grateful, Ann, that you are joining me for this conversation. I think I can share my screen. I hope. Let's see if this works.
Both Shay and I have been really excited for this presentation, so thank you folks for joining. We're happy to be here.
And I want to tell everyone as I get my screen share up here and ready to go that I am currently right outside of Philadelphia in my office at Villanova University, where there are thunderstorms rolling through. So in case I disappear, I will come back if the internet goes down. So forgive me. Here we go. All right. So Anne and I have had this conversation about the equality and the abolitionist model for years at this point. And as everyone has known, the entire world and everyone's conference over the last year was canceled. And right as we were all going into lockdown in the middle of March of 2020, 2 weeks from then is when we were supposed to be having our annual conference here at Villanova. And Anne had thoughtfully put together a presentation. She was going to moderate a panel of survivors to have a conversation about progressive prostitution policy. And obviously we did not convene, and it was so new into the pandemic. We had not been able to fully shift into, the Zoom presentation platforms that we're on today. So over the summer, I guess, maybe even last semester, I think it was in the fall, Anne and several survivors did a panel discussion, and Anne moderated that panel. So we're going to touch a little bit about that. I also can share with all of you a link to the video of that conversation because it's incredibly impactful. And I have some quotes that my students have pulled together and put in here, but I think that watching that conversation is just beyond anything that Anne and I can even tell you today, right? Like listening to survivors, their lived experiences, informing all of us as allies who work in this movement, I think is the crux of what makes our work meaningful and impactful in the world. So the teacher in me just wants to go through the learning objectives really quickly with all of you. We're going to discuss the abolitionist movement today in light of current pro-sex, pro-prostitution lobbying and movement happening in the world that I think we're all really inundated in hearing about. We're going to examine the abolitionist movement goals and how they best align with female empowerment and equality, and how legalization of prostitution continues to perpetuate gender inequality, lack of female choice, sexual violence, poverty, despite arguments presented by members of the pro-sex work agenda. So, Anne, if you don't mind, I'm just going to tell everyone really quickly about the 4 policy options when it comes to prostitution. And I want you to jump in and interrupt me at any point here, but there are 4. And people here in the US are really focused, I think, on 2, right, Anne? Like it's just decrim, what does decrim mean?
Mhm.
And the equality model,
Right.
That's no one's having a conversation really about the full breadth of these policy options. And we have to start with what the status quo is.
Absolutely.
What is happening right now, right? So in all 50 states and Washington, D.C., and in the U.S. territories, prostitution is a crime. Sex trafficking is a crime under every state's law and under the federal law, obviously, with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that passed. So we have to start with the status quo. We're also going to break down what legalization means, what full decriminalization means, and then we're going to talk about the equality model and why we think it is the best and most progressive option for what the U.S. states should be doing. So first, it's nationally and locally what's going on right now. It's a crime in all 50 states, prostitution. Buying sex is also a crime in all 50 states. The federal government cannot decriminalize prostitution. Prostitution is not a federal crime, it is a state crime. There is no law that the federal government can enact or repeal to decriminalize the sex trade. So there was a lot of conversation during the presidential primary and lead up to the election about who was, pro decrim, pro sex work. And I kept saying to people, I don't know why the presidential candidates are having this conversation about it being a policy option, because the feds don't have jurisdiction over prostitution. The states do. So just to be super clear, and I keep repeating myself, but I think there's value in repetition and learning, is that prostitution is governed by state law, not federal law. And it's only legal in the US in, I believe, is it 7 or 9 counties in Nevada at this point? 7, Ann?
I think it's 7, yeah.
Yeah. And you guys, it's not legal in Las Vegas. It's 7 counties in the state of Nevada that are very rural counties that, according to a survivor that Ann and I know really well, Rebecca Charleston talks about this experiment that the state of Nevada was going through 48 years ago. And it was voted on in these very rural counties based on population to allow legal brothels and prostitution and buying sex to take place. And I know that they're getting ready to go back into legislative session, and they're trying to get that back on the ballot to have these counties say, you know, we don't want prostitution happening in our state legally in these 7 counties, because I believe that the statistic is that sex trafficking is 63% higher in the state of Nevada than any other state in the US. And it's because of that, you know, those 7 counties that have legalized prostitution. Again, you guys, every single state in Washington, D.C. criminalizes both the sale of sex and the purchase of sex, but we know that the way that the sex trade is policed and prosecuted, and I don't want you all to think that the only way to eradicate the sex trade is through policing and prosecution. It's too big, it's too robust. We need to really shift societal attitudes about prostitution and buying sex, but we do know that when police do investigate the sex trade, even when they claim to be investigating for human trafficking, we know that their focus is truly on those who are in prostitution, and they're the individuals that are criminalized more often than not. So why decriminalize a person's in prostitution? And that's what we advocate for. It's a piece of the equality model that we'll talk about a little bit more, but a person who is bought for sex may be a crime victim and is not a perpetrator. We know that criminalization of persons in prostitution is traumatizing, it's stigmatizing. We need to improve relationships between people in prostitution and law enforcement. We know that traffickers absolutely target incarcerated individuals for prostitution recruitment. And I highly, highly recommend you all Google it. It's free. The Guardian put out a documentary a couple of years ago called The Trap. It's 30 minutes of your time, and it's incredibly valuable. We wanted to diminish the permanent and temporary collateral consequences of criminalization, eliminate opportunities for debt bondage, and avoid confirming negative messages propagated by traffickers. So legalization. And I don't know if you want to jump in here or not, but it basically means legalizing and regulating the entire industry, right? Like,
absolutely. I mean, so it legalizes, you know, every aspect, sex tourism, sex buying, the sale of sexual acts, promoting, which is the legal language for pimping, which most folks understand a little bit better. And the only thing that is that it continues to prohibit is sex trafficking. But you know, countries that legalize the commercial sex trade, and we'll talk about this more, but they show the same consequences as countries that fully decriminalize the commercial sex trade. So we will talk about these 2 models, you know, and provide some distinction between the 2, but I think it's very helpful for folks to know that legalization and full decriminalization are really are very, very similar models, both in their intent and in their consequences, and in the you know, the logic behind why they're implemented. So when you think of legalization, it was a model that was advocated for by the commercial sex trade, you know, about 20 years ago. It was the popular model to advocate for. And then in the, you know, recent 10 years, it's been shown to be like quite a disaster internationally. And we'll talk a bit about what it looks like in Germany and in the Netherlands, but it's been quite a failure. And so the sex trade pivoted. And they have now started to attempt to distance themselves from legalization, and will advocate internationally for what they now say is full decriminalization.
Right. And so that leads us into what is full decriminalization. So don't forget that the legalization piece is the government is now involved, right? The government is supposed to, regulate the industry. They can tax the industry. The people involved in it are subject to all applicable labor laws. And this was supposed to, in theory, really protect people who were working in prostitution and in the sale of sex. But it doesn't, I have a lot of statistics on slides later. If we don't get to them, please know in advance. I'm going to share all these slides, but Anne's right. It's the state, meaning Germany, the country, or the Netherlands, is profiting off of this in addition to the managers, and the consumers, right?
And the profits are both through taxation, and then also through sex tourism. So sex tourism, this is a multi-billion-dollar trade. Germany alone brought in upwards of $6 billion in 1 year, through sex tourism and through taxation. So this is a very lucrative trade, so the governments benefit. And what countries that have legalized have found, so when a country legalizes, usually at the federal level it's legalized, and then responsibility for enforcing laws, for regulating brothels, registering individuals as workers, that falls usually to the municipal governments. And what they found is there's now this dissonance between the municipal government and the federal government, because the municipal governments are seeing a multitude of negative impacts of legalizing the commercial sex trade. They're seeing the violence against people who are being bought and sold. They're seeing the just the general unsafe areas that grow, where the brothels and the red light districts are placed. Those areas are in general unsafe for women, whether those women are in the sex trade or not. And so the municipal governments will have, in the Netherlands and in Germany, have turned to the federal government and said, we really need to re-examine these laws. But unfortunately, what they found is that the government can become addicted to the revenue. So it's very incentivizing for the government to maintain legalization because of that incredible revenue that's coming in.
Okay. So decriminalization is very similar, but it just means the decriminalization. So persons in prostitution and persons who are purchasing sex, it's legal, right? They're not going to be criminalized for that behavior. And we hear a lot of conversation. It's actually going on in Ann Arbor, Michigan right now with the decriminalization of consensual sex work. So if you are selling sex and you are purchasing sex and it's consensual, again, I put consensual in quotes because Anna and I could sit here and talk to you about the topic of consent for probably 3 hours without even taking a breath at that point. But there is this belief that sex work is an exercise in personal autonomy, where consenting adults exchange sex for money, and it completely fails to recognize that there are inherent harms that happen in the sex trade, and it's inherently exploitive. And no matter which way you slice it, legalization with the government getting involved to regulate, or decriminalization, you cannot in any way, shape, or form regulate away or legalize and fix those inherent harms and the fact that it's exploitation.
And I'm going to just jump in for a second, Shay, and say, so there is no true full decriminalization regime in operation in the world. The closest thing that we can provide as an example is New Zealand. But the reality is that when the sex trade is fully decriminalized or no longer regulated, there is always still some sort of regulation that's happening on the municipal level. So there is some sort of regulation in terms of registering the brothels or registering the individuals who are quote unquote working in the sex trade. And so there's been an attempt to really establish that these are separate models, but we know that there isn't actually a true full decriminalization regime in existence. And I want to also just be clear for, so folks understand that full decriminalization, it's eliminating laws and penalties associated with all of the sex trade. So this means that sex buying, pimping, brothel owning, the sale of sexual acts, sex tourism, all become legal. And just to answer that question quickly that was in the chat, when we say sex tourism, yes, it definitely includes men from the United States traveling to other countries, buying both adults and children in the sex trade. The abstract theory behind full decriminalization is that the sex trade, which is a trade rife with violence and abuse, will somehow self-regulate to prevent that violence and abuse. But countries that have fully decriminalized, which is really only New Zealand, parts of Australia, and Denmark a little bit, but we won't go into the nitty-gritty of that. But those countries show the same consequences as countries that legalize. They show that they have seen that there's an increase in the number of men who buy sex. They have shown that they have an increase in women and children who are trafficked from poorer nations to meet that demand for paid sex. There's an increase in the number of children who are sold in the sex trade, who are bought. They've also found that sex buyers and traffickers perpetrate high rates of violence. They continue to perpetrate high rates of violence against people in the sex trade, which to us, it really verifies what we know, which is that violence and abuse is inherent to the sex trade. It's not something that can be regulated away. They've also found that organized crime controls the majority of both the legal and the illegal sex markets. So there are a lot of stats on this and investigations that have been done that show that, I'll give the Netherlands as an example. In the Netherlands, a major investigation, law enforcement investigation, found that 65% of the legal brothels were under the control of criminal gangs. They also find that in countries that fully decriminalize the sex trade, that the brothel owners are conspiring with traffickers to fill their legal brothels with primarily women and children of color, because they cannot find folks who actually genuinely want to be bought and sold for sex, multiple times a day, multiple days a week, multiple weeks a year. And I just want to say one last thing about full decriminalization before we move on, and that is that full decriminalization removes legal and social barriers to male demand for commercial sex. So what this does is that it normalizes sex buying. Men who would otherwise be deterred from buying sex on ethical or legal grounds are encouraged through laws and advertising to buy sex. So these countries that are fully decriminalizing the sex trade, they are actually really encouraging the growth because they're normalizing the sex trade. And so it's important to keep that in mind when we talk about this issue.
Yeah, and Alexia, I know that you're out there listening. If you wouldn't mind putting in the chat for everyone the link to that piece that we cite to all the time about the normalization on violence against women in the sex trade. And I apologize for swearing, but it's the title of the piece. It's called "Bitch, You Got What You Deserve: The Normalization of Violence in the Legal Brothels in New Zealand and in certain parts of Australia." And the researchers looked specifically at the review boards where the men, and it was all men, went to buy sex and then took the time to basically go on Yelp, like we all do for visiting someplace and you're looking for a great place to go for a hamburger, right? You'll look at Yelp for the reviews. Well, they have these review boards, and sex buyers have gone on and they analyzed 147 of these reviews and then the over 2,000 responses. So it's normalization of their language and the dehumanization of women that they've purchased like a commodity. They take out even referring to them as she, but refer to them and as things. And it's really, we don't want to normalize that here in the US, right? We already have enough problems with gender violence and misogyny. I don't think we need any more, but that's what they have studied. And again, this is directly this community of they refer to them as punters or sex buyers, that are, it's words right out of their own mouths that they've typed, for the public to see on these review boards. So the final policy option, which is what both Anne and myself and our movement which is oftentimes called the abolitionist movement, advocate for is the equality model. And it was first referred to as the Swedish model because Sweden was the first law to enact the law in 1999, and it was then expanded, in pieces of it were expanded to the Nordic countries. It became the Nordic model. Here in the US, it's being referred to more often than not as either the equality model or partial decrim. I haven't heard anything else that it's referred to. Have you, Anne?
No, well, asymmetrical decriminalization, but we don't need to, I don't have to, I feel like there's so many different terms that it can be overwhelming and confusing.
But I think the equality model is pretty much what the conversation is. And I know that a lot of organizations are coming together and forming these equality model coalitions. I know that New York has one and that you're very involved in that, Anne. Louisiana has one. I believe Oregon is about to put one together. So they're coming together, but there are 4 clear tenets of what makes up equality model in the law. And it's that prostitution is decriminalized, meaning it's not a crime to arrest someone for any longer selling sex. The second piece of it, and law enforcement commits to this, we're not going to arrest anyone and charge them with the crime of prostitution. Prosecutors are not going to prosecute it. So the legislative response is that hopefully every legislature in the US eventually will just delete the crime of prostitution from their crimes code. The second piece of it is that criminalization of sex buyers will remain in every crimes code because they're already there, but law enforcement and prosecutors have to start treating this crime as a serious crime rooted in violence against women, and also maintain the criminalization of the traffickers and those who profit from the sex trade. The third piece of it is a public education campaign that's for everyone to learn about, the whole world, kind of like Mothers Against Drunk Driving did, right? When we started educating everyone that it was unsafe to drive if you were inebriated. We need to get out the word about the inherent harms in prostitution. And then none of that can happen unless we have funded, robust, holistic exit services for people who want to exit the sex trade to take advantage of. We know that to date, 10 countries have enacted this, and there are 3 additional countries with partial elements. But what is happening in Europe, and what you might be hearing, is that Europe is actually moving towards decriminalization. That is absolutely untrue. European countries are moving towards this equality model. Anne, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to I realized that at the beginning I forgot to do this, and so I wanted to do it just to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So when we, Shay and I, our perspective, and it's the perspective that was advanced by Sweden, is that prostitution is a severe form of gender-based violence, and that it falls on the spectrum of gender-based violence, along with other forms of gender-based violence like domestic violence, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, rape. Prostitution is often what we say the intersection of a lot of other forms of gender-based violence. That is the perspective that we're operating from, and that is that perspective informed the equality model. When the equality model was developed in Sweden, it was initially it grew out of the women's shelter movement, and so there were a lot of women who were working with survivors of the commercial sex trade, and they were witnessing firsthand the incredible harm, the physical and psychological harms that these survivors were living with. And so these direct service providers started to advocate and say, there's something going on here. At this time, this was before the equality model. At this time, Sweden actually had a decriminalization, a full decriminalization model in place. And a lot of these women were starting to say, we don't think that this is right. We think that this is actually a product of male violence against women, and that it should be addressed as such. And so these a lot of these advocates then began to talk to the, members of the parliament, the Swedish parliament, the Riksdag. And at the time, the Riksdag was comprised of 50% women representatives and 50% men. And the advocates really were very successful in educating their female counterparts in the Riksdag. And the female counterparts then took it upon themselves to educate the male counterparts. And they really started to shift the perspective from one where prostitution is seen as as a vice, as a failing on the part of the person who's being bought and sold, to one where, it's actually people with social power who are taking advantage of marginalized communities, those who are impoverished, those who are homeless, those who are addicted to drugs, women and children who are, who have had histories of childhood sexual abuse, that they were taking advantage of their vulnerability in order to profit off of them in the commercial sex trade. So that's just, a quick overview of our perspective. And I want to contrast that with the perspective that is taken by those who are advocating for full decriminalization. So folks who advocate for full decriminalization, they hold the perspective that prostitution is just another form of labor, like any other form of labor that you can think of, that it's the equivalent of, selling clothes or, working as a mechanic or doing any other, labor. And that if we were to just decriminalize it, then all of the violence that takes place in the commercial sex trade would just magically disappear. And so those are the two different perspectives that we're coming with.
Thanks, Anne. So we can talk about choice versus culpability. I'm going to send these out to you. I also gave a TED talk on this topic, so you can just, when I send out my PowerPoint, I'll send out those resources. But I think Anne really hit the nail on the head, right? That it's who has choice, and looking at people who are impoverished, women and girls primarily of color. Do they have a choice? Or are they merely trying to survive in the sex trade by putting food on the table, by not living and having to live in their car? And who has all of the choice when it comes to the sex trade? And I would suggest to all of you that sex buyers have all the choice in the world. They are the ones choosing to buy sex, and they don't have to buy it. And so we need to sort of reframe, like Anne was saying, the paradigm and how we talk about prostitution and where the choice and the culpability really does lie. So you guys, these slides are chock full of information, and Anne and I've already talked about it quite a bit, right? Like what they did in Sweden. There's some statistics, what's going on in the German mega brothels. And I think that, I know we only have until 3 and we are monitoring the chat, but I think what's really important, and again, this is like New Zealand, the Reform Act, all these things, and I'm going to send additional resources for you guys. But I think what's really, I actually said all of this out loud. This website is amazing. And Anne was part of the creation of this website. It's equalitymodelus.org. It is phenomenal. You guys can lift right from the website, like we did for this PowerPoint, really great graphics that talks about where the equality model is enacted and compares it with where full decriminalization and legalization are the rules. And what happens is that the demand for prostitution actually increases, sex trafficking increases, support services aren't available for people who want to exit. And I think the crux of this, and what Anne and I really do focus on in a lot of our work, is that where the equality model has been enacted, we know that there is more buy-in to gender equality. And I think that's really important for all of us to focus on. So Anne's conversation with survivors, and I'm going to send the link out so that you guys can actually see it, was beyond impactful to me. And I really value the perspective of the survivors that Anne selected to put on this panel. And I don't know if you want to talk about, the differences in the types of sex trade that the survivors were involved in, gender specific, all of that, or if you just want to cut right to the questions and give some of their answers.
I think I might be misunderstanding you, Shay, but do you mean the just like a general overview of the various forms of the sex trade that exist, or specifically the survivors that were on the panel in there?
I think both, because the survivors that were on the panel really did make up,
Yeah.
a really great sort of compilation of the way that the sex trade happens, not just here in the US, but Suzanne J was here from,
Yep.
Was part of the panel from Canada. And I think that there isn't a one size fits all to the sex trade. And I think it's really important for all of us to keep that in mind.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll talk a little bit more about this issue more broadly too, because I think it really helps when you are, sitting down with someone and you're having dinner or what have you, and this conversation comes up. I think that it's helpful to have some of the details about what actually is happening in the commercial sex trade, right? So, the panelists came from a range of perspectives. We had an amazing colleague of mine, Christian Eduardo, he lives in the United States. He's undocumented, a survivor from Mexico who was trafficked here in the US. Suzanne J, a survivor from British Columbia, who worked very hard to get the equality model passed in Canada. Elisa Bernard, who is the co-director of the Organization for Prostitution Survivors, and Cherie Jimenez, who I don't know as well, but I know that Cherie is working in Boston, works with youth and children who are trafficked in the commercial sex trade. And
She founded the Eva Center for women exiting prostitution and the sex trade. And Cherie was involved in the sex trade before there was such a thing as the internet. So she was really involved in street-based prostitution. And I will say, has convened a group of survivors, you guys, in Massachusetts, where they have the equality model pending in Massachusetts legislature. And Cherie has been the one tirelessly has sat down with, the mayor of Boston, the new mayor of Boston, the governor, the attorney general, and has just, used her lived experience and also her professional experience of working with women who've exited prostitution to really bring a holistic conversation so that there is so much political will and buy-in to get the equality model passed in Massachusetts. And she's been working with, Audrey Morrissey from My Life, My Choice,
it's a really
Nikki
good
Bell, Nikki Bell from Living in Freedom Together in Worcester. I mean, there is just phenomenal work being done in the state of Massachusetts on this topic as well. So, Anne,
yeah,
you were so thoughtful when you put this panel together, right? Because we can't look at individuals in the sex trade as one size fits all, right? Like, there's street-based prostitution. We experience so much of that here in Philadelphia, the open air sales of sex, which is coupled with our opioid crisis. There's the illicit massage businesses. There's the escort services. There's, a conversation that I feel like I have all the time because I work in a university, is the concept of sugaring. It's just another name for prostitution, right? When young college grad students are signing up to get a sugar daddy to get all their bills paid, and there's an exchange of sex, for that, it is prostitution. It's also very violent. And a lot of people are first introduced into being trafficked because they started sugaring. I don't know if I'm missing anything.
I mean, there's pornography is another means through which individuals are bought and sold for commercial sex, and it's very linked to the the other aspects of the commercial sex trade. The commercial sex trade like we said before, it's a multi-billion-dollar international trade. And so there's a lot of people who are benefiting from it. There's a lot of will to see this industry, permeate every aspect of our society. And so there's a lot of, creativity, like bad creativity in integrating the, commercial sex into, like Shay was saying, onto college campuses, into the social media. So, there are new efforts now where pimps are targeting youth on social media, where they'll send out, hundreds of messages to youth, or they'll specifically look for youth who appear to be vulnerable. It's really helpful for us to have a clear understanding that the commercial sex trade, entry into the commercial sex trade, is driven by systems of oppression. It's driven by poverty, homelessness, community violence, family violence, childhood sexual abuse, trauma. And what we see is that those with power abuse their power and use it to exploit others for profit and personal sexual satisfaction. Deep-seated inequity is really integral in order for commercial sexual exploitation to exist. If the world were completely equitable, there would not be these marginalized, vulnerable populations that could be preyed upon by traffickers, by brothel owners, by sex buyers. So it's helpful for us to really think about how the sex trade is really, it depends on inequity to exist. I know that we sometimes see in the media this narrative that being bought and sold for sex is empowering, and that there's the language that folks use is sex work, and they say sex work is work and sex work is empowering. But the reality of survivors who luckily survive and are able to exit, which in and of itself is an incredible feat. And the reality of those folks like myself and Shay, who are direct service providers who work alongside survivors and work with survivors, the reality that we see is this not one of empowerment. It's one of desperation, and it's one of exploitation. And it's important, to reiterate again that sex buyers and traffickers specifically target folks when they're most vulnerable. The traffickers and pimps specifically groom individuals, so they will often go after someone who they can tell is homeless, or someone who they can tell has low self-esteem. They will create manipulative stories in order to convince that person that they will be better off if they, join the trafficker. And it's a very manipulative way of luring people into a trap, and that trap is the sex trade. There's an amazing survivor who says the easiest thing in the world is getting into prostitution. The hardest thing in the world is getting out, and that, I think, absolutely encapsulates what we see over and over again. But I also really want to just, again, I think it's always important that we bring it back to the buyers and just say that the sex buyers perpetrate extraordinarily high rates of violence alongside pimps and traffickers against people who are bought and sold in the sex trade. We're talking about very high rates of sexual assault, like brutal acts, acts that, rise to the level of torture. And the consequences of it are severe medical, psychological, physical harm. So, we see a lot of folks who have traumatic brain injuries from having their head slammed into car doors and windows, folks who have anogenital injuries from being bought repeatedly for sex, folks who have
traumatic brain injuries from being thrown out of a car and then had their heads banged into the curb. We had one client who had been in a coma for 3 months and was never going to get her memory back. It was the sex buyer who did that. Yeah, broken bones, dental trauma. I mean, you name it, survivors have lived it. They have rates of post-traumatic stress disorder that are equivalent to returning war veterans because of the violence and abuse that is inherent to the commercial sex trade. So it's important, for us to always
reframe this conversation from one of talking about, how much choice and agency a survivor has, to one of why is it that there are a significant portion of men in our population that are buying other humans for sex, and how do we change that? Like, we can change it. Sweden changed that. So how do we, as a society, commit to changing that as well?
So I've been leaving these slides up with these quotes, you guys, the questions that Anne asked and the responses. I've been leaving them up for about 2 minutes each so that you all can read them, but read exactly what the survivors' responses to these questions were. And again, I'll send out the link to the actual conversation that Anne had, but they're so incredibly impactful. And, Suzanne J, from Canada is, this particularly resonates, most recently with what has just happened in Atlanta. And if you think about those horrific murders of the women in those massage businesses in Atlanta, there's been conversation, is it misogyny? Is it racism? It's both. You can't look at them as individuals. It's a combination of both, and the over-sexualization. And at the same time, the contrast of how society, especially in the US, views Asian women as being, over-sexualized and simultaneously innocent. But think about the man who confessed as to why he went and committed those murders. It was to take away his temptation. And he, quote, had a bad day, had an addiction. Again, this is self-reported that the media has told us, had an addiction to pornography. And so he had the ability to remove what he believed to be his temptation. And so he was clearly a sex buyer, right? And murdering someone is the ultimate form of harm. It's just, I can't divorce my thought process from like, it's inevitable and boys will just be boys and, you're entitled to buy sex, and still call myself a feminist and not and advocate for it to be just like work, like going to McDonald's to work. I have a really difficult time trying to reconcile those conversations in my own head. Cherie's quote here, which is everything. And for all of you who are working, in this field, the best way to promote the equality model, and I think, Anne, why you have had such success in New York with shifting hearts and minds of people who are running for office right now, is because you are bringing survivors, into these conversations, right? They are the ones.
Absolutely.
With their experience.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm so fortunate to be on the New Yorkers for the Equality Model Coalition, working with a number of survivors, and I've, over the past decade, been fortunate to work alongside an incredible number of powerful survivor leaders across this country and internationally. And survivors are really what we call attention to, is that in the media, the commercial sex trade is often presented in a very sanitized way. And it's presented, full decriminalization is presented as a great solution to the ills of the sex trade. And the media is often only presenting, it's a very one-sided perspective, right? And what we found is that survivors, those who have lived through the horrors of the commercial sex trade, it's incredibly difficult to speak publicly about your most intimate experiences of exploitation and violation. And yet there are hundreds of survivors, thousands of survivors around the globe who have come out, who have said, I don't want this to happen to any other, women or children. And I'm going to advocate to make it stop. And some of them have been willing to share their stories to help us understand the reality of the commercial sex trade, to understand that there isn't empowerment in it, that they are not walking away, that no one gets out of poverty via the sex trade, that actually folks get trapped and many don't survive. And so, as Shay is saying, it's really important to always honor that survivors are leading this movement and have been very brave. And even though there isn't a multi-billion-dollar industry behind them, they have managed to ensure that their voices are being heard.
And there was a question here, which I think that you are more poised to answer than I am. And I think it's really important. So I'm just going to read it for everyone in case they didn't see it in the chat. Is, in my community, sex worker rights advocates are citing research out of Canada mostly that suggests that increasing penalties for buyers decreases the abilities of sellers to negotiate safety. It's not just in Canada. Every single sex worker rights platform has this statement as part of why they advocate. My thought always is you have to assume that there's a way to make it safer in the first place, and there just isn't one. And I don't know what you want to add to that.
My dear friend and colleague, Trisha Baptiste, who is also a survivor leader and the founder of Formerly Exploited Voices Now Educating, she's Canadian. She lives in British Columbia. She worked to pass the equality model there. When she gets asked this, the first time I heard her say it, I was so impressed. She said, I had 1 minute, I had 2 minutes, I had 10 minutes. It was the luck of the draw. I could never know whether the sex buyer who was buying me was going to be a man who beat me, who raped me, or who attempted to murder me. And I think it's a really important question for us to ask. Think about this. If you're meeting up with a complete stranger who's buying you, who you're going to get naked with, and who you're going to engage in sexual acts with, a complete stranger, how much time do you think is going to enable you to know whether or not that person is going to be violent? I mean, the reality is you will never know, right? How many questions, is there the right, what question could you ask them to ensure that that person isn't going to just, turn out to be Jeffrey Dahmer? There's nothing that you can do. The reality is that it is inherently risky, and that the likelihood that you're going to sustain bodily injury at one point or another is extraordinarily high. There was a physician I worked with who said to me, sometimes when my clients first start in the commercial sex trade, they think that they have some power and control, and then the doctor said, but it's only a matter of time before they meet their first buyer that tries to kill them. And that's the reality of the commercial sex trade. So, when you talk about negotiating condoms, for example, let's go back to those sex buyers in Australia, right, who were rating women on the review boards. So those sex buyers, they would rate the women very poorly if the women were not incredibly enthusiastic, if they showed any disinclination, if the women would not engage in any number of aggressive or painful or degrading sex acts. And then they would rate them poorly and say, don't go to her. And so what this did was it sets up a situation where the women feel like they can't say no to anything. So really, is there consent when you have money on the table? Is there consent to a sexual act?
And one other thing that I want to add is Houston, Texas did some really good stuff. They were part of the CEASE network. And I know that we're running out of time, and everyone's time is incredibly valuable. So thank you for listening to us. And before I say what I'm going to say about Houston, Texas, when I send out these slides, you guys, we put together policy and practice. So you can see harm reduction, we give you scenarios, and then what is going to be happening in each different policy sort of bucket. So what would happen under the status quo with legalization and full decrim, and then the equality model. So we've broken out 3 distinct scenarios that you can work through, and it's very clear we lay them all out for you. And then again, the relationship between sex trafficking and prostitution. So please, just, give us props if you use them. But I did want to let you know that that is something incredibly valuable that my students very thoughtfully put together. But Houston, Texas, their police department doing some anti-demand investigations, specifically targeting sex buyers, set up a fake illicit massage business in a strip mall. And this was a couple of different summers ago, obviously pre-COVID, but they arrested during, I guess it was a week or 2 week long sting, well over 200 men. And this was widely reported in the media. And these are men who are going to get a massage. And I say that, with quotes. And some of the men that they arrested were registered sex offenders, had just rolled off the sex offender registry, one of them brought a knife, another one brought a knife, a gun, and handcuffs. So again, these are men thinking that they're, going to get away with it. And how is it that a woman who, if this was a massage business, right, was going to screen from a client who just walks in the front door of the strip mall and not knowing, what is she going to pat him down and see if he has a knife, a handcuffs, and a gun? But why on earth are you taking a murder kit to get a massage? And so it's just inherently dangerous, no matter which way you're going to screen it. And I know that we're out of time for an hour. And I'm so grateful for you jumping on this with me. I'm looking to see. There's one more really long question from Jeff. Currently in the sex trade are more of the vocal voices in the pro-sex work movement. So let me just say something. Sex work doesn't just include prostitution in the US. I choose never to use the term sex work for a whole bunch of different reasons, and you can Google why on my website. We've written about it quite a bit. Prostitution is what's in the law, that is the crime in the law, as is sex trafficking, as is buying sex, and it's usually called patronizing prostitutes or something to that effect. But what I have found in the pro-sex work movement are those who are advocating aren't necessarily involved in prostitution, meaning selling sex. There's webcamming, there's stripping, and I don't know what else you're seeing, but there is a spectrum of what gets kind of lumped in under this pro-sex work movement. And we know that webcamming has just gone out of control during COVID, right? OnlyFans is gone bananas. But
and we also, I can speak from New York's experience. We had a bill that was introduced 2 years ago to decriminalize the sex trade. And in that bill, they want to not only decriminalize, the people who are being bought and sold, which we support. They want to decriminalize sex buying. They want to decriminalize pimping. And they want to erase criminal records for those who have been convicted of sex buying and pimping. And I can tell you that the statutes that prohibit pimping, which is promoting, are actually the statutes that are very often used to prosecute sex traffickers. So it really, there's a lot of legal explanation for this, but really it when you fully decriminalize, it really makes it very difficult to stop even sex, to stop the worst of the worst. It makes it difficult. It just allows the sex trade to flourish, and it becomes the laws for full decrim are very amenable to those who profit and to those who buy sex. They're not amenable to those who are the ones who are being bought multiple times a day, multiple days a week, multiple weeks a year for sex.
Go ahead, Ann.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I see it's 3:06 and folks have stayed on. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for giving us an extra 6 minutes for this topic and, for engaging in a conversation with us. I really appreciate your willingness to hear us out on this topic. I'm grateful to have been part of this conversation.
And I have promised, hi Hillary, I have promised Ariel that I am going to email this PowerPoint that I put together for everyone. Anne and I's, are also available. I will share both of our emails as well if you guys have additional questions, but I just want to recap that I'm going to send out the video of the panel, the conversation that Anne had with the survivors, which is just, phenomenal and blew my mind. I'm going to send out some information on sugaring, including a couple webinars that Anne and I have seen and participated in with World Without Exploitation. Angie Henderson has put them together along with a survivor, her partner in the Avery Center for Research and Services in Colorado. It's really phenomenal. So I'll send out that link. I'm going to send out the link to the TRAP, which is put together by The Guardian, the article, the scholarship article put together by the women from New Zealand, the scholars down there, about the normalization of violence against women in the brothels, and these slides. And if anybody wants anything else, I work in academia. If I can't find it, one of my students could probably find it. And we're just happy to answer questions, and for you guys staying engaged this whole time and paying attention. Thank you from the bottoms of our hearts.
Yes, thank you, Shay and Anne. This is just such an important conversation, and I appreciate both of you just taking your time to share with us. And just to reiterate, we will send everything out to all the registered attendees. And I know I've already gotten some text of some watching that want to connect with you guys further. So I'm just excited to further this conversation and advocate for this model, because I think it's what's needed in the US. So thank you guys for the work that you do.
And the one piece of advice that I'm going to give to all of you is, we've been fighting this issue a lot in Pennsylvania. We have some competing circulation memos, no introduced legislation yet. We have some rape crisis centers and domestic violence centers, asking us about the equality model and saying, our staff are really involved in advocating for pro-sex work because our clients, say that they are sex workers. Of course, we reflect the language of those who come to us. We never, ever tell someone how they can identify. But if your organization that you're looking are looking to take a specific position, if you're not going to take a position on the equality model, Anne and I would just be grateful if you just stayed neutral and didn't take one at all. Right? I mean, we think that the equality model is the best way to go, and we will give you all the information to back it up. But if you can't come to an agreement, whether you're board of directors or advisors or whomever, just stay neutral on the topic. We would be grateful.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Well, thank you guys, and thanks everyone for staying on. And yeah, we'll get all this information out, and we load the webinar video on our website as well. So if you want to send it to anyone else, we'd love for you to share it. So, all right, thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.